Okay, so welcome back, everyone. I hope you were able to grab some coffee. So our next presenter is Aparajita Das Gupta at Ashoka University. Aparajita will be talking about legal bans on sex detection technology and gender discrimination. And the paper will be discussed by Anukriti at the World Bank Research Group. Anukriti, you know the rules, or you want to again lay them down? Up to you. I think Anukriti is on mute.
Yes, sorry. Hi, Prasanna.
So, do you want to lay down the ground rules before Aparajita starts?
I don't think I know the ground rules. Sorry. Uh,
She has about 30 minutes.
and then I think I have 10
Yeah,
minutes.
30 to 35. Sorry, I'm supposed to be the chair, so you don't know the ground rules. So you have 30 to 35 minutes to present Aparajita, and then Anukriti will give her comments for about 10 minutes or so. Aparajita, then you can respond to those comments, and then we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience. Okay, please go ahead.
Thanks, Farzana. Thanks for giving the opportunity to present this new work with my colleague Anisha Sharma. Good evening, everyone. This is a new work, so comments are very welcome. The topic is, can legal bans on sex detection technology reduce gender discrimination? So to introduce to this topic, so there's a growing body of evidence which speaks about how son preference manifests in the form of direct discrimination by parents, where parents may discriminate directly against girls, or through son biased fertility stopping behavior, where parents would want to go on with the fertility until they have a boy child. And so this can induce indirect as well as direct discrimination against girls. Now, access to sex selective abortion allows parents to substitute prenatal for postnatal discrimination. The idea is that when parents have access to sex selective abortion, daughters who are carried to term, who are born in that regime, are more likely to be wanted, who would face lower postnatal discrimination because of the simple fact that they are actively wanted. So there's a body of evidence on this theory, which has found the relationship between access to sex selective abortion um, and reduction in gender based discrimination from across the countries. Um, so the analogous argument is that a ban on this technology of sex selective abortion might increase unwanted girls who would face increased discrimination in the form of lower health investments, and through also the channel of fertility stopping rule, where parents may want to bear a child until they have a son because now the sex selective abortion technique is absent. So what we do, this paper actually investigates the causal impact of the ban on sex selective abortion in India on gender gap in health outcomes, and compares welfare consequences with the policy that tries to shift gender norms. So let me give you the context of both policies that we study in India. So in terms of how to think about policy targeting sex selective abortion or the problem of missing women, so the broad categorization of policy interventions have been under two types. So there could be supply side interventions such as restricting sex selective abortions, or there could be demand side interventions that try to shift preferences and motivate investments in the girl child. uh, through behavioral change of parents, such as through sensitization campaigns or through financial incentives. Now, in this paper, we first study the PNDT Act, which was a supply side restriction on sex detection and sex screening technique. This was enacted in a staggered manner across Indian states between 1988 and 2003. Next, we compare and contrast with this new scheme, which is the Beti Bachao Beti Padhao scheme that you may all be aware of, which is primarily a awareness campaign, a mass media campaign aimed at gender sensitization that emphasizes the value of daughters. This was also rolled out in a phased wise manner, rolled out in 100 low child sex ratio critical districts in 2014-15. So what we do is we leverage the geographic and intertemporal variation in the rollout of these two policies to study their impacts on gender discrimination in a host of welfare outcomes, starting from mortality, nutrition, and health investments. Now, where do we situate our contribution? So, we causally estimate the unintended impacts of the Indian ban. So, this study by Nandi and Devlalikar found that this ban improved child sex ratio. However, the topic of the welfare implications of the ban on health investments and health outcomes has been understudied. So we contribute in that domain. And so we contribute to this small but growing literature of the on the impact of supply side restrictions on on changing gender bias. Secondly, we provide the first estimates of the very new policy, which is the Beti Bachao Beti Padhao program. And in this way, we contribute to the literature on the role of mass media awareness and behavior change campaigns on shifting social norms. So there's a new body of literature that tries to examine how such interventions can change hardcore gender bias. So we contribute there as well. So our setting allows us to identify and contrast the efficacy of a supply side intervention with a demand side intervention. So this has very crucial implications for the design of policy on the choice of instruments that could be undertaken in societies which are characterized with systematic neglect of daughters. um, our setting actually allows us to harmonize information on exogenous policy shocks to study a range of outcomes, starting from mortality, health investments, nutritional outcomes, and fertility outcomes. And in this manner, we are able to throw some light on the potential channels behind our results. So, just to give you the preview of our results, broadly, we find that the ban on sex selective abortion increased the gender gap in mortality, nutritional outcomes, and health investments. Families that were relatively intensively treated by the ban, which is the families with firstborn girl child, have higher fertility and lower birth spacing post implementation of the ban. We find preliminary evidence that the Beti Bachao Beti Padhao program reduces neonatal mortality and improves health investments such as breastfeeding. This is more stark for higher order births. So let me just get into the policy timeline that we are dealing with here. So this is just the history of how we could think about how sex determination techniques actually happened. In 1970, we have the earliest form of sex detection technique through the introduction of amniocentesis in India. 1978, the sex determination of fetus is banned in all public healthcare facilities. 1985, we have the introduction of ultrasound technology. 1988, Maharashtra is the first state to ban all sex selective abortion, including private clinics. This is important. 1994, we have the enactment of PNDT Act. And 1996, this act was actually implemented across all India, barring Jammu and Kashmir. 2003, Jammu and Kashmir enacted its own ban. 2015, we have this new policy, which is the B3P scheme, which is implemented in 100 phase 1 districts. So, to give you a more institutional context of this ban. So, the ultrasound technology had significant advantages, being very cheap, highly accessible, non invasive, portable machines, allowing availability in rural areas. This paper by Balhotra and Cochrane estimates the spread of ultrasound technology led to a selective abortion of up to over 4 lakh girls per year, which is about 6% of potential female births. This is huge. Government of India enacted PNDT Act in 94. This was operational 2 years down the line. This put a ban on using the sonogram to determine the sex of the fetus. In terms of the penalty, it included imprisonment up to 3 years with fine of 50,000 rupees for the first offense and higher penalty for any subsequent offense and confiscation of medical license and equipment for the health provider. Now, how effective was this ban? So there's some controversy about the efficacy of this ban. However, this paper by Nandi and Devlalikar find that this ban actually raised the child sex ratio by 14 to 26 points. So, increase of at least an additional over 1 lakh surviving girls aged 0 to 6 years in the newly treated rural areas. And there's a follow-up paper by Nandi 2015, which finds that this ban raised the odds of a female birth by about 1%. Let me give you some details about the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao scheme. So this scheme was launched primarily to ensure survival, protection, and education of the girl child. As mentioned before, this was introduced in a phase-wise manner. So this was given in the first 100 low CSR districts, which were critical in terms of skewed sex ratio between 0 to 6 years. This is the phase 1 district. This was expanded later to 61 additional districts in 2015-16. So what did this involve? This is, as I mentioned before, primarily a mass communication strategy involved spreading awareness through radio jingles, television messages, SMS handouts in regional languages, celebrating the birth of a girl child in the community, mobilize people through film shows, rallies, quiz shows. It also involved school principals, teachers, ICDS staff, village sarpanch, members of panchayat, as well as health workers, ANMs, Anganwadis, ASHA workers. So there's this recent NCAER survey from 14 states, which finds that nearly 88% of respondents were aware of the B3P schemes campaign. Importantly, ensuring the proper implementation of the PNDT Act was also part of the B3P scheme. So this actually provides us a unique setting to comment on the relative efficacy of legal bans when combined with demand side interventions. So in terms of thinking about how the various activities were budgeted, you could see that a chunk of a budget was allocated to awareness generation, community mobilization, and there were other components like training and capacity building, innovations which involved like celebrating the birth of a girl child, and so on. So now coming to the data that we use. So the data primarily comes from the National Family Health Survey. For our mortality and fertility analysis, we use retrospective birth histories between 1975 and 2016 for women aged 15 to 49 years. Um, it includes 1.3 million observations from all births drawn from over 6 lakh rural and urban households from all 640 Indian districts. Fertility data includes complete birth histories of around 7 lakh women. For child health outcomes, we use the pooled rounds of the 4 NFHS surveys, which were conducted in 1992, 93, 98, 99, 2005, 6, 2015, 16. So this includes over 3 lakh, about 4 lakh observations on child health, which includes information on objective biomarkers like height, weight, BMI, and health investments. So in terms of the outcome variables, we study a range of outcomes starting from mortality. We create indicator variables for neonatal mortality, which takes value 1 if the child dies within the first month of birth. For infant mortality, it takes value 1 if the child dies in the first year of birth, and under 5 mortality taking value 1 if the child dies in the first 5 years. In terms of health outcomes, as mentioned before, it has great data on objective biomarkers, measured height, measured weight, BMI, health investments, again, very detailed data on breastfeeding duration, antenatal care visit, tetanus shots received, and so on. For fertility outcomes, we compute the probability of birth. We look at proportion of girls born and also birth spacing. And I'll give you more details as I go on. So in terms of our empirical strategy, we exploit the exogenous variation from the staggered rollout, which is from both spatial and intertemporal, to compare outcomes of girls and boys within the same mother. So this is extremely demanding specification. So our main estimating framework controls for mother fixed effects, birth year fixed effects, and state specific time trends. This is for the PNDT. And for B3P, which is the variation is at the district level, we include district specific time trends. We control for a number of confounding factors, including mother specific preferences, again by using the mother fixed effects in a very demanding specification. Secondly, we build upon the new study by Anukriti, Balotra, and Tam, where they use the quasi-random variation in sex of the firstborn to explore relative difference in outcomes for firstborn girl child. So what they find is the access to ultrasound technology. So we just test the analogous argument, and so we make use of that, where both the respective policy shock and the sex of the firstborn act as treatments. So more formally, let me lay down the estimating equation. So this is the broad research framework that you can think of. So we have a host of outcomes. So YIMST is one of the mortality indicator among neonatal, infant mortality, and under 5 mortality, or nutritional outcome, which is height for age, weight for age, BMI, or health investments such as breastfeeding duration, visit to antenatal care, and tetanus shots. For child I, born to mother M in state S in year T. So in this equation, we control for, and so treat IMST is equal to 1. This is the indicator variable if child I born to mother M is born in state S in the year T, where the respective policy has been implemented. So the policy, you can think this is either PNDT or B3P and 0 otherwise. we are able to control for state specific time trends for the PNDT evaluation, and district specific time trends for the B3P evaluation. We include birth year fixed effects, mother fixed effects, and importantly, we cluster the standard errors at the state level for PNDT, and then we correct for using bootstrapped clustering, and at the district level for B3P. Now, the second hypothesis that we test is using the quasi-random variation by the firstborn family. So the idea is that if parents are not selecting the sex of the firstborn child, this is as good as random. And so the if the ban is imposing a higher constraint for firstborn girl families, there should be difference by this margin. And so this is what we test. So why IMST is the indicator for mortality or health outcome for child I born to mother M in state S, born in year T. And so the rest is as before. Firstborn female takes value 1 if mother M of child I has a firstborn girl child and 0 otherwise. So this firstborn female variable is defined for the mother of the index child I for whom we are studying the outcome. And then we are able to control for state specific time trends, mother fixed effects, birth year fixed effects. So the coefficient of interest is again with the interaction term beta 3. So let me get on to the results. So this is showing the impact of PNDT on mortality. And what you can see is here the interaction term is positive and significant. The first three columns show the effects for birth orders 2 and above. So the idea is that if discrimination is higher for at higher birth orders, this heterogeneity should come up in the results. So we do this separately for all birth orders, as well as looking separately for birth orders 2 and above. And across the board, you can see that this is positive and significant at 1%. So this is saying that the relative mortality difference actually goes up. So the female mortality, the relative female mortality goes up post ban, and more so for birth orders 2 and above. And as you can see from the bootstrapped p-value, this is significant at the 1% level. So these estimations, as mentioned before, include mother fixed effects, birth year fixed effects, and state-specific time trends. Okay, and importantly, I think we should mention here that the sample restriction here is that we are looking at children born between 1985 and 2005 in this table. The reason being that we want to look at the range. We want to restrict the range of the sample such that these are comparable groups pre and post treatment. But we also do some robustness checks looking at the full sample that is up to 2016. Next, I want to show you the results for PNDT by firstborn female family. Again, you see that the relative mortality actually goes up for firstborn female family post ban. This is positive and highly significant across the board. So this is the full sample 1985 to 2016, and this is 1985 to 2005. We think this is a more comparable group. And as you can see from the bootstrap p-value, these are all highly significant. So as our hypothesis was that if female firstborn families are more affected by the bans, the mortality is going to increase relatively more in these families post ban, and this is what we find. Let me show you next the mortality estimates for the B3P program. So at the outset, we must mention that this is a fairly recent policy, and whatever we are finding here is a very short run result, the first estimates, if you will. And so this is looking at this interaction is we find that neonatal mortality actually goes down. This is significant at 10% level for all birth orders. So B3P program seems to improve or reduce mortality, neonatal mortality, and seems to help um, with the health outcomes. Uh, Coming to health outcomes, objective biomarkers, we find that this is very, very stark, that the exposure to PNDT leads to negative health outcomes. So basically, this is the relative difference between females and males. So the height actually goes down disproportionately more for the females post ban. Again, splitting the sample for birth orders 2 and above and all birth orders. Again, you can look at the bootstrap p value. This is again very significant. So seems that health outcomes suffered because of the ban. Um, Health estimates for B3P, we don't have any significant results for B3P. And so, so this is, okay, moving on to the impact of PNDT and B3P on health investments. So just looking at duration of breastfeeding in months. Um, I think someone is talking.
Can you unmute? I think.
I think Kazi. Okay, so let me go on. In terms of health investments, we find that if you, this is if you focus on this interaction between treat PNDT and female, and then treat B3P times female, we find that the breastfeeding duration actually goes down for the case of PNDT and seems to go up for B3P for birth orders 2 and above. So this result is very significant for higher order births where you would believe the discrimination is more. Okay, now coming to the analysis of pre-intervention trends. So this is a event study graph for mortality outcomes. So the estimates that you see here, these are plotted from the regression of child mortality on the interaction between treat and female 10 years before and after the ban. So this blue line that you can see refers to the zero time where when the ban was implemented, and this is showing the results for the regression for birth orders restricted to 2 and above. As mentioned before, we control for state specific time trends, child birth year, birth order, and mother fixed effects. And so what you can see here is that doesn't seem to be the case that this is driven by pre-intervention trends. We cannot distinguish it from zero. Similarly, for the second hypothesis, which is the interaction between the treat and firstborn family, again, if you look at the period for IMR neonatal and under 5 mortality, this seems to be pretty not different from zero, and then seems to take off after the implementation, after the zero line. And so the way you want to think about this is, since this was staggered in a phase wise manner, so we have variation across states over various time points. And so this zero line pertains to the time when the ban came for that particular observation in that state, right? Okay, so in terms of exploring the mechanism, so we test the two potential channels which affect where the ban on sex selective abortion could affect gender gap in child health. So the first hypothesis is that the increase in number of unwanted female births. So if the ban was really effective, it should have increased the number of female births, and so this is implying that there would be higher neglect of girls. So what we do is we really test the first stage, which is we examine if the ban increased the proportion of female births, and secondly, we test whether there is this selective continuation of fertility for firstborn female families to attain the desired sex composition of children. So basically, with the advent of the ultrasound access, families could use the ultrasound technology to attain the desired sex composition of their children. But now, with the ban on the technology, they would again go back to this fertility stopping rule, and again, more so for the firstborn female families. So, as a result, girls end up with larger families and greater sibling competition for resources because of the fertility stopping behavior. And so, what we test is if fertility increases relatively more in firstborn female families. So, these are the results. Interestingly, we also put the other policies so as to just compare the effects of various policy shocks. So, as found in the Anukriti Balotra and Tam paper, the early diffusion actually resulted in a decrease in fertility for female firstborn families, and we do find that here with our data set and our empirical strategy. Uh, we find that if you look at this interaction between treat and firstborn female, this is positive and significant. So it's actually opposite. So the ban is producing result opposite to what you have with the access to the technology, and this is what you would expect if the ban has increased the cost of accessing sex selective abortion. And in terms of the B3P result, we don't have any significant results, but again, these are very short run results. And if we look at long run data, perhaps we could get the true estimate of the treatment's effects. Okay, next we explored the proportion of girls born to a mother. And so what we find is for PNDT, this actually goes up. So this is really testing the first stage, that whether there are more girls being born after the ban, and we do confirm with our data that that is the case. Although there are other papers already that have found this using some other data sets, for example, census and DLHS, we do confirm the same result with our data set, which is the NFHS data. In terms of the B3P results, again, we find that it has this negative sign, but again, not significant. At least since B3P had both the components of demand and supply, you could think of this as perhaps mitigating some of the effects of the supply induced restrictions. And so, not getting a significant result could actually be a good thing. In terms of birth spacing, um, we find that for firstborn female families post ban, the birth spacing is going down, and this is going with the line that fertility is going up. So birth spacing would mechanically would go down, and we do confirm that. And so this is looking at the difference between the number of months between the first and the second pregnancy, and this is we are restricting this to females with two children, following the strategy as used in the Anukriti Balotra and Tam paper. And again, we exactly find the opposite result here. Again, B3P, it's not significant. Um, okay, so I think I'm out of time. And so let me conclude what we get. So we find that the ban on sex determination worsens outcomes for surviving girls relative to boys. Families with firstborn girls have higher fertility, lower birth spacing, higher mortality in the post-ban period, with worse of child health outcomes. We compare our results to the Anukriti Balotra TAM paper and show that the access to and restriction of ultrasound technology and abortions leads to symmetrically equal but opposite effects. And this can speak to, the general question, how far technology restriction on accessing technology yields symmetric results as compared to access to the technology. So we do find that. Our preliminary results on the B3P program suggest the potential usefulness of demand side elements to tackle gender bias. B3P policy exposure reduced neonatal mortality for all births and improved breastfeeding duration for female children for higher order births. So, what our results suggest is that supply side restrictions on sex selective abortions need to be thought extremely carefully, as it can lead to other forms of discrimination that undermine the purpose of the policy. So, let me conclude. Thank you, and I look forward to the comments.
Thank you, Aparajita, for a very interesting presentation. I'll invite Anukriti now to give her comments. Anukriti, are you able to share your screen? Okay.
Yes. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes,
Okay, great. Okay, can everyone hear me all right?
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So let me proceed. I'm just going to make this full screen.
Anukriti, you can put your video on, so if you want, then we can see you and hear you both.
Okay, just a second. It always gets complicated, when they're like the screen and the video. Wait. Hmm. Okay, can you see me?
I don't think I can. Okay. Aprajita, can you?
So my video is on and I can see myself in that little window on the
I
side.
can see
I
you.
can see. I can see.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. So, all right. So I'm just going to zoom in. All right. So thank you, Prajita. This was very interesting to read. It's almost like a mirror image of my paper. So it was interesting to see how things switch. So before I go into the more detailed comments, let me sort of just frame it for everyone again. So we know that in the 80s, when ultrasound technology became available in India, there was a huge increase in sex selective abortions. So my co-author Sonia has a paper which estimates that nearly 6% of all female births were aborted in India in the 1995 to 2005 period. And this number is going to be higher if we look at more recent years. So the response from policymakers has been broadly of three kinds. One is that there have been bans on prenatal sex determination as well as sex selective abortions, which is what the paper today focuses on. There have been conditional cash transfers. So I have a paper on that where the government is basically trying to incentivize parents to have more daughters. And thirdly, you have programs which are sort of mixed. For instance, the Beti Bachao Beti Padhao program, which Aparajita mentioned, which has a combination of things where they try to change the norms as well as try to improve enforcement of existing laws. So what we find in our paper, one of the papers I have with Sonia, is that when ultrasound technology became available, it enabled parents to switch from postnatal discrimination to prenatal sex selection. So son preference in India is not new, and gender discrimination is also not new. So all these things were happening before ultrasound technology became available, but what it did was it enabled parents to do that before the child was born, essentially. And so what we find is that as sex ratios become more male biased, you also see a decline in postnatal gender gap. So now you have a moderation in son biased fertility, you find a narrowing of gender gaps in parental investments in health, for instance, breastfeeding, immunization, and so on, and also a decline in gender gaps in mortality. So what Aparajita and Anisha do is they sort of answer the converse question. But so if we have programs like the PNDT Act, which do the opposite, which is that they try to make it harder to sex select, then are we not in the the same situation we were before ultrasound technology, which is that now parents can go back to postnatal discrimination rather than prenatal sex selection because the son preference hasn't changed. So unless son preference changes, some these types of programs can simply lead to substitution from one type of discrimination to another type of discrimination. So that's sort of how I feel the paper is placed. What they find is, so they focus on estimating the impacts of the PMDT Act, which Aparajita mentioned, described in detail, as well as the Beti Bachao Beti Padhao program on postnatal gender gaps. So I think there's a previous study with, I think Anisha is one of the co-authors, which finds that the PMDT Act, so this is sort of the first stage. We want to know, did the act in fact change sex selective abortions? Because that's sort of the mechanism here. And so what they find in that paper is that the probability of female birth did increase by 2.5 percentage points. So it suggests that it prevented people from having sex selective abortions, and the effects were more concentrated in poorer families in rural areas. So the main finding then, the second stage sort of this paper is that the act then, so it reduced prenatal discrimination or sex selection, but in turn increased postnatal gender gaps in mortality, in health outcomes, in health investments. And in terms of mechanisms, what they find is that there was an increase in discrimination against unwanted girls, and fertility also now increased. So this is again the opposite of what we find because of increase in access to ultrasound. They find that fertility instead now, because of reduction in sex selection, goes up in firstborn girl families. And then they supplement this analysis with findings from Beti Bachao Beti Padhao. So I have several comments. So let me try to structure them in the following way. So first, let's think of the data. So if I'm not mistaken, what they do is they pool NFHS 1, 2, 3, 4 for health outcomes analysis. And I see why you need to do it, because NFHS is actually not giving you information on health investments for all children. They only have this data for the last 2 births or things like that. So, and this is the same reason why we actually don't use NFHS for health investments analysis. In our paper, we look at REDS, which collected this data. One of their rounds collected this data for all surviving children at the time of the survey. So, so you have to pool in order to be able to have a large enough sample. But for fertility and mortality analysis, you use only retrospective birth histories from NFHS 4. So my first question is, why not use the pooled sample for the mortality and fertility analysis as well? Because since you're doing a retrospective analysis, a sort of data construction, and the policy reform you're looking at changed in 1996, what you are basically doing is observing people in 2015-16 and finding births which were born before 1996 and then after 1996 from that data, right? Your sample is going to be, so if you actually plot the sample distribution of years of birth by year of birth for your births in the sample, you're going to see that the years before 1996 are going to be just much smaller, because you're looking at women who are 15 to 49 in 2015-16 and retrospectively getting their birth history, right? So and that sort of, not only that creates problems for unbalanced sample, but it also creates recall error and lots of other things. So since you're already pooling the data for the health outcomes, my recommendation would be to just pool the data from for this analysis as well, especially because one round of the NFHS was 92-93, another one was 98-99. So you will get much more pre-96 sample from those data sets than you would get from NFHS 4. So that's sort of my first comment. Second, I think I'm a little concerned, or like, I mean, it's not something that you can do much about, but I feel there is not that much policy variation in the analysis. So what we see is basically Maharashtra has its ban in 1988. Then there is a national ban except for Jammu and Kashmir in 1994, which became effective in 1996 and then had more strengthening in 2002-3. And then there is a Jammu and Kashmir ban in 2002. So for most of your analysis, essentially we are looking at, so if you, for instance, exclude Maharashtra and Jammu and Kashmir from your sample, I would like to see what the results look like, right? Do you find similar results? And if most of your sample is basic, most of your estimates are driven by the whole country, then essentially we are looking at before 1996 and after 1996, right? So I know you include state-specific time trends, but then it's even more important for you to include for other types of time fixed effects, or things that vary by time, because a lot is happening in India over this period. right? So essentially, that is the period when trade liberalization happened and so many other things happened, that that one structural break pre post 96 may not be the best way to capture it. And this is something that, even in our paper we have to think about, because we use the time variation we use is splitting this into three groups. But the way we address it is not only do we look at the girl versus boy gap, we also introduce firstborn girl versus firstborn boy variation. So then it gives us more variation. And but so I have follow-up comments on how you should also do that. So but essentially that's my other comment. And so if you look at, for instance, your figure one, uh, this again, so this is related to my previous point about why you should pool your data, because if you look at the early years, the sample size is so small, likely to be, that your confidence intervals are just very, very wide, right? So it's not only the fact that there wasn't much going on before, but it's also that you just have a lot of your standard errors are quite high. So and then even if you look at it, it looks to me a bit of a upward straight line rather than a structural break. So my advice would be to introduce another source of variation which you can actually use is the firstborn girl, because what I feel you are doing is you run two types of specifications. One is where you compare boys and girls before and after the ban. And then you have a separate specification where you compare children in firstborn girl versus firstborn boy families before and after the ban. But why not combine these two like we do and create a triple difference? Because then that sort of gives you much more variation. And as you are showing in your double, and but it's good that you do both these double differences. But now there is could be a third thing where you combine the double differences into a triple difference, and especially because you are finding that the effects are concentrated in firstborn girl families. So I think that might be a bit more helpful. Um, I liked the table where you sort of see how the fertility effect switches in the early diffusion period and then the PNDT period. But then I was a bit confused because in our paper we actually find, so we are splitting the sample into pre 85, 85 to 95, and the 95 to 2005. So when we started the paper way back in 2014, there was no NFHS 4. So we were only using NFHS 3. But 95 is very close to 96 is what you are using. And we actually find that fertility, in fact, decreased in firstborn girl families relative to firstborn boy families after 96. Whereas in your case, you're finding the opposite. So I'm a bit confused about why the results are different. So I think that might be something to look at, because we find that for both periods, early and late diffusion, there was a decrease in male biased fertility, whereas what you are showing is that there was a decrease in the early diffusion period, but then increase in the late diffusion period. So something to this will come up, I guess, when you submit the paper, and so it's nice to think about it in advance. And also, I think another thing you can do is look at the total number of children. So one of your fertility tables are basically looking at probability of birth in any given year. And but that's just, that could also be reflective of just the timing change. But what matters is whether the total number of children completed is also changing in the same direction. And I think I forgot one point here, which I had somewhere, was more about mother fixed effect. So I think it's nice that you do the mother fixed effects and use that as the main specification, but it does sort of reduce the sort of estimating variation that your results are based on. So I know in the appendix you have tables where you show without mother fixed effect. So my advice would be to also bring them into like in the front of the paper and have columns where you gradually add mother fixed effects to see how the things change. Okay, so that might be clearer. Other comments I have is, so I was a bit confused about equation 4, I think, where you look at the sex ratio, the effect on the proportion of girls, I think. So is that the same as what the other paper does, or is there something different that is there? So if it is similar, then I don't know why. So basically, I think either put a bit more detail about what that other paper finds, what is their identification strategy, is it the same data set that is being used, And is it being estimated in the same way? And if not, then estimate the same thing using your strategy to show that it's, and your data, which may be different, that you find exactly the same thing for your sample as well. I don't know how I'm doing in terms of time, but I just have a few more comments. So one is about,
You
so
have
the
a couple
Beti
of
Bachao
minutes.
Beti Padhao, sorry, Farzana?
Yeah, you have time. You have a couple of minutes.
Okay, that's enough for my comments. So in terms of Beti Bachao Beti Padhao, I think you know that the analysis is less rigorous, because it's just that there isn't enough post data, unfortunately. But I think in terms of interpretation, so we've been talking to one of my collaborators. We've been talking to Haryana government on with somebody who's responsible for the implementation of Beti Bachao Beti Padhao, and so even though there is a lot of push on, we all see, behind auto rickshaws and trucks, there is Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. So there is, of course, a lot of emphasis on trying to change norms. But at the same time, a lot of the effort is also being put in enforcement of the PNDT Act. So, in the case of Haryana, so they do a lot of these decoy raids. They'll come up with fictitious, they'll have like an undercover pregnant woman who will go to a hospital, and then they try to sort of seek sex selection or prenatal sex determination, and that's how they catch people and then file an FIR. So there is a lot of that as well going on. And my sense from, again, this is more just discussions with these people, is that there's a huge state variation in these things. So in Haryana, the enforcement was pretty strong for certain years, whereas from what I hear in UP, not much was going on. And then what people do is they go from the bordering areas to the neighboring state to do things. And so it would be nice to sort of, put the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao results in that context. So it's not clear to me that it's all demand side sort of an intervention. It's actually a mix of things, whereas, and that mix itself may be different across states. In some states, it's maybe mostly demand. In some states, maybe it's mostly, the one or the other. And then, it might be nice to show where those 100 districts are, because as we know that these were the gender critical districts where they first started. Where are these located? So just the variation should be a bit more clear for the reader to understand what we are comparing. I didn't see, I think, I'm not sure if I missed it in the paper, how these programs affect sun preference, right? So at some point in the paper, in the beginning, you mentioned that if sun preference doesn't change, then we are basically making people simply substitute. So in our paper, I think we do check for the impact on sun preference and we don't find, but it would also be nice, since you have a new round of data, which we don't have in our paper, to also explicitly see what's happening with sun preference as measured by, it's not a good measure, but the ideal number of boys, or the ideal proportion of boys. Because especially because if you're looking at it Beti Bachao Beti Padhao, maybe if there is a norm change, then we want to see whether there's a change in that proportion. So that's another outcome variable that you can look at. And lastly, I think it might be good to do sort of what we do in our paper, is to sort of quantify the substitution that's taking place. So we find, I think, for every one girl, every 4 girls aborted, there was one girl who survived, who otherwise would have died because of this substitution. But in your case, it's going to be the opposite. So it might be nice to sort of, you can see the paper in how we do it, and maybe try to quantify it in the same way to get a sense of the magnitudes for that. And yeah, I think that's, other than that, I think that's all the comments I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anukriti, for a really exhaustive set of comments. I would have ordinarily asked Aparajita to respond, but I just think that given that, we are running short of time, and we are very privileged that Sonia Balotra is also here. And Sonia's, we
Hi,
explained.
Sonia.
Hi,
Yes,
Anu.
yeah, so it's great that all the, the references that Aparajita has here and Anisha are here. So I think Sonia wants to share some thoughts as well. So Sonia, please go ahead.
Thank you, Farzana. Thank you, Anu. So Anu already stole my thunder a little bit with some excellent comments. And Aprajita sent me this paper. I apologize, I haven't read it yet, but just listening to you, your presentation was very clear, very nicely done. I have some comments, and will only say what Anu hasn't yet emphasized. So first, I should just congratulate you. I think the basic idea of trying to look at supply side and demand side interventions in the same paper is really nice. And of course, to update, because now the interesting thing is whether policies are working and the rest of us having documented the problem. So my first comment, because I know referees will home in on this, and of course, because I believe it too, is your event study. So you do point out that the pre-trend coefficients are not significantly different from zero, but those event studies cause more concern than they mitigate, because there's a very clear pre-trend. There's no structural break, so the pre-coefficients happen not to be different from zero, but the trajectory is of a fairly smooth trend. So I think that's a concern. There's no structural break. And I just wanted to point you to recent work by Ram Bachchan and Roth. It's a quite new paper, late 2020, which allows you to live with the fact that there are non-parallel pre-trends, and it gives you a procedure for putting bounds on the dynamic effects, the post effects, even when parallel trends don't hold. So you could use that, because I don't think you have parallel pre-trends. The other thing is, as Anu said, if you only really have J&K and Maharashtra deviating from the national implementation, you have very little policy variation, which is what Anu emphasized. But also, I wouldn't really expect J&K and Maharashtra to be a good control group for the rest of India. But so the procedure for creating synthetic controls has been around for some time, since invents. But very recently, there are some quite straightforward new methods for constructing these synthetic controls. So I think your situation is one where you should construct a synthetic control. And that will solve your event study. That should solve your event study problem, because you construct the synthetic control to have matched pre-trends. So that's one thing. And then I guess the same comments hold for your analysis of BBPP. I don't think you showed us event studies there. You have much more variation, you have district level variation, but so you might find something interesting, and so I'd expect to see an event study for that policy shock. And also to look more at documentary evidence for what determined adoption. So what you want is that the timing of adoption is quasi-random. So I would first do an event study, then do the Ram Bachchan Roth estimates if you have a deviation from parallel trends, and then if you still need to build a synthetic cohort. And then what I liked most about your project is this bringing of supply and demand shocks to the same paper. But unless I missed it in the talk, I think you're not ever interacting them, and I wondered why. So if you were to interact treatment with PNDT and in turn with BBPP, then you could see exactly the extent to which the demand side intervention is undoing the supply side intervention's adverse effects. Or in other words, you can look at the demand side intervention with and without the supply side intervention. Also because BBPP was so staggered over time, over I think 24 months, I think it can give you more variation and also be interesting in a substantive sense to look at how long it takes for sort of media-related attempts to change social norms to actually have an impact. So because this is not a policy actually, if it's implemented well, does switch on immediately. But anything about social norms and media information campaigns is likely to have a slow creep. So you could look at dynamic effects at the time since implementation of BBPP. And then another comment, again, somewhat related to Anu's comment about coming back to numbers, to substitution, if you think of 3 periods, a baseline, when we had no ultrasound technology, then a period that we've analyzed, which is the arrival of the technology that makes it feasible to sex select, and then a third period, which overlaps with the second, which is the arrival of policies trying to inhibit this behavior. I think you're consistently speaking of how PNDT undid sex selection, but it's a big open question is the extent to which any adverse effects of the PNDT on sex selection and later, sorry, not on sex selection, but on the substitution after birth, postnatal selection, exceeded or only partially reverted to baseline. So basically bring back your estimates to the baseline rather than to the already interrupted sex ratios in the period when the technology is available. And then lastly, as we all do, you show us DID estimates. And so you show us the difference between treated and control, where treated is girl and control is boy. But it's quite useful to see each. So you can show us the trajectory for, let's say, boy mortality and the trajectory for girl mortality, so that we know whether it's the case that girl mortality is going up or whether it's simply declining more slowly. I think that's everything.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for taking